Hello and welcome. I'm delighted to welcome you to the latest Royal Academy of Engineering's Cafe, Connecting Awardees and Fostering Engagement series. My name's Professor Karen Holford. I'm the Deputy Vice-Chancellor at Cardiff University and I will be the chair for this evening's session. Today we'll be discussing design principles for national infrastructure. We'll begin with a brief introduction and a short presentation from our panel, followed by a brief opportunity for you to pose questions. Please note that the main event session is being recorded and may be published on the Royal Academy of Engineering website. Throughout the event, I'd like to encourage you to submit your questions by simply clicking on the Q&A feature located towards the bottom of your screen and type your questions into the open field. I will attempt to cover as many questions as possible, time permitting, of course. So in February 2020, the National Infrastructure Commission's NIC Design Group published its design principles for national infrastructure. The group inspires, promotes and champions design excellence in all nationally significant projects. I'm really delighted to introduce you to today's fantastic panel. They are Professor Sadie Morgan, OBE, Founding Director, DRMM Architects and Chair of the NIC Design Group. Louise Wyman, Strategic Director, Growth and Development of Manchester City Council. Judith Sykes, Senior Director, Expedition Engineering. Anthony Dewar, Professional Head, Buildings and Architecture of Network Rail. And Claire Donnelly, Director, Faraday Pollard Architects. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Sadie, who will introduce the design principles for national infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'm so pleased to be here. Thanks to everybody for coming. Delighted to see so many of you here. Thanks to Hanif Kara for making the connection, and to the Royal Academy and their fabulous in-house team to make this happen. For my part, I'd like to give some context for today's cafe by introducing the design principles for national infrastructure. And given the time, I'm not going to spend too long introducing the Commission itself, and I'm sure as many of you know, it was established in 2015 to provide the government with impartial expert advice on major long-term infrastructure challenges. Alongside our own work plan, we produced major studies on topics commissioned by the government, but our main task is to produce a national infrastructure assessment once a Parliament looking ahead on the major policy shifts that need to be made, that need to be made to prepare the UK for the future. Next slide, please. And in preparing for that future, it's essential that we properly design our infrastructure, because if we don't, the consequences are dire. Design thinking needs to be at centre stage from day one and at every step throughout delivery. At its heart, design is about problem solving. It's about people with different talents getting together and finding creative solutions. Unlike clearly what happened in the illustrated slide here. Next slide, quickly. Let's get on to some good stuff. So embedding good design, however, isn't, of course, just about a bridge, a flood defence, or a substation that's pleasing on the eye or fits with the local environment. It's about projects that are resilient over the long term, reducing maintenance and replacement costs, saving money over the long term. And it's about projects that reduce risk to and protect the local environment. Good design means learning the lessons, of course, from the past, from the failures as well as the successes. And it means thinking about how great infrastructure can truly shape a town, a city, or even a whole country in a way that makes people feel proud to live and work there. It's easy to say, of course, but clearly as an industry, we need help to make that happen. So how can we get involved? Next slide, please. In May 2019, the NIC established the Design Group, which I chair, and the group's design expertise spans engineering, architecture, landscape and transport, and its mission, as has been said, is to inspire, promote and champion design excellence in all nationally significant projects. Next slide, please. Our first major project has been to research and produce the design principles. First off, we commissioned a literature review and roundtable discussions with a range of people involved in the creation and maintenance of national infrastructure. Many of those people we spoke to thought that too often design had been treated as an afterthought on major projects. Our research identified a strong demand for design principles that would set an ambitious vision and enable projects to deliver good design throughout the project lifecycle. These principles are the first of their kind for the UK. Nationally significant infrastructure projects have never shared a design vision, and the literature review examining over 60 papers found no equivalent set of principles spanning the 6 sectors of the Commission's remit. One common theme throughout our research was the need for the principles to be written in non-technical language and comprehensible to a non-professional audience. And we wanted people reading the document to think the recommendations are intuitive and even obvious and common sense. The simpler the expression of the principles, we thought the easier it would be to embed them. Next slide, please. The first of our the principles is climate, and I'm sure everyone on this call would agree that the design of our infrastructure must help set the trajectory for the UK to achieve net zero greenhouse emissions by 2050. And even more important after this week's announcement by the government that it will set the world's most ambitious climate target into law to reduce emissions by 78% by 2035 compared to 1990 levels. We want major projects to seek every opportunity to mitigate climate change, and those opportunities may of course lie outside the project boundary. Projects should include a method for measuring emissions over the full lifespan of their project, with the infrastructure designed with sufficient flexibility that changes can be made if it's not performing as it should. And good design will also enable the people and businesses using infrastructure to reduce their wider climate impacts too. Next slide, please. Our second principle is people. A good design process embedded from the start of the project will seek opportunities to improve the quality of life for people who live and work nearby. Infrastructure should be designed for those people, not just for architects and engineers. It should be human scale, easy to navigate and instinctive to use. Good design will create accessible, enjoyable and safe places with clean air that improve health and well-being. But it won't always, of course, be possible to please everybody affected by the project. And this should be acknowledged and steps taken to mitigate any negative impacts. Next slide, please. Our third principle is places. Major projects should look to improve the places in which they are built, not just mitigate the damage. The design of our infrastructure should support the natural and built environment. Projects should make active interventions to enrich our ecosystems. They should seek to deliver a net biodiversity gain, contributing to the restoration of wildlife on a large scale while protecting irreplaceable natural habits. Well-designed infrastructure will help give places a sense of identity, and projects should be inspiring in form and detail, and while not beholden to the past, should of course respect local culture and character. Next, please. Our final principle is value. A good design process will add value by defining issues clearly from the outset. That can be helped by convening multidisciplinary teams with shared understanding of the issues. Solutions should be sought that solve multiple problems at once. Good design doesn't necessarily increase cost, and I think one of the most common misconceptions we found that it did. Solutions can provide more for less, with savings on cost, the environment, materials and space. And good design will look for opportunities to add value beyond the main purpose of the infrastructure. It should look beyond the project boundary to consider the wider projects and benefits the project can bring. And how about using the design principles? That's the next slide, please. Our design principle document contains a one-page guide which explains how to use each of the principles. From the start and throughout a project, everybody involved can help implement the principles. Design isn't just the responsibility of designers. And we do that by appreciating the wider context, engage meaningfully, and continually measuring and improving. The guide contains examples of the sort of questions that projects should be asking themselves around these 3 themes. And the principles are not intended to be prescriptive. There's space for major projects and industries to produce their own set of design principles, many of which have already done this. It's worth stressing again that we see design as the responsibility of everybody who's involved in the project. We can't rely on design champions and review panels alone. Everybody involved in designing national infrastructure, from designers and planners to project managers and sponsors, can play a role in embedding these principles. Next slide, please. We all want everybody involved in creating the UK's infrastructure to embrace the principles, and we're all really pleased that government has formally agreed that all infrastructure projects should have board level design champions by the end of this year. This commitment was made in the recent National Infrastructure Strategy. The document also pledges that design panels will be appointed where appropriate. Naturally, we think this is on the vast number of major projects, and we're also encouraged to see government's commitment for design champions and the design principles to be embedded in the IPA's delivery support and assurance regime for scrutiny throughout the project life cycle. Despite the many challenges of COVID, we're in a decade where many big infrastructure projects will begin. Their legacy will be defined by the quality of their design. The UK has built infrastructure which has inspired people throughout its design before. It can do so again, and addressing the climate and environmental impacts of all major projects, as well as creating places of which communities can be truly proud. Thank you. I'm going to hand over, I think, to Louise next.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sadie, so much for that introduction. It is fantastic to be here. I'm really delighted to join the session this evening. I'm the Strategic Director for Growth and Development for Manchester City Council. And what I want to try and do is convey in a short amount of time how critical the principles that Sadie's introduced, those of climate, people, places and value, are to how we see growth and development in Manchester. And I'll use a couple of projects to illustrate how we're responding and building on the principles and the great work that's happened nationally. So Manchester, I know you all know where it is, but very much a city that has a rich heritage, but also faces out. We're very much a European city. That's how we think. Despite the times we're in, we keep strong connections to the Europe and internationally. We've got a lot of investment that comes into the city from overseas, and also an awful lot of networks that we rely on that actually share our ambitions, help us promote things like the design principles. And we're very focused on the climate emergency. We have a net zero carbon ambition by 2038. So that's a big part of the work we do with European cities. We're also part of the Resilient Cities Network worldwide. Next slide, please. So just to give you, I won't go into all the detail of how we approach some of the ambitions and the design kind of integrity that you see coming through the principles, but we have a key strategy which we call the Our Manchester strategy. It's very much at the heart of everything we do in Manchester, and it has a lot of resonance with the National Infrastructure Design Principles. Our Manchester is a strategy. It's based on people, place and prosperity. So you can see kind of people in place right at the heart of what we're doing, and prosperity similar to value. And then directly underneath that strategy for the city, which we've developed with partners across GM, as well as city partners and anchor institutions, we have Manchester's Green and Blue Infrastructure Strategy. And again, that's a big part of how we drive some of our climate ambitions. We have a climate change action plan, which is really significant. We have our local plan and the planning process, of course, and we're doing a huge amount around biodiversity to increase that, just as Sadie has outlined. We're doing a whole refresh of our parks and open spaces. There's some amazing new green spaces coming on stream in Manchester, which I'll show you. And then lots of work around tree planting and ambitions for urban woodlands and so on. So we're doing a lot with our growth and development and the investment that comes into the city to achieve the ambitions that are in sync with the design principles for national infrastructure. Next slide, please. So all that needs to work in an economic context as well. So lots of great ambitions, but it has to be about growth and investment to be able to fund, create the jobs and create inclusion. We've got very diverse communities across Manchester. So our economic strategy has those same foundations, people, place and prosperity, but it's also keenly focused on inclusion, so that our communities who have maybe had less opportunities and less life chances in the past can be included in the growth. And that's the document that you're seeing on the left of your screen, and on the right is what we call Powering Recovery. So this was a document that I developed and worked on with my team. We launched at budget in November of last year, and it sets out our recovery plans in response to COVID, again, pinned on the same principle of people, place, prosperity, and it outlines 50 projects that we're seeking direct investment into the city. And many of those projects will have the social, they will need to deliver the social outcomes that I've touched on, will need to help us address the climate emergency, and will absolutely be about kind of innovative, progressive infrastructure. So let's come on to some examples of what that looks like in reality. Next slide, please. So I thought I'd start with two projects to share with you. One from, this got going roughly 20 years ago, late 90s, over 20 years ago now. New Islington, it's an area of Manchester in Ancoats, which was traditionally an industrial area when the mills were productive. It had gone into a serious decline in the period of industrial decline in the post-war years. And you're seeing some images here of the 80s, early 90s, when even the post-war housing had also failed. You had antisocial behavior, you had all sorts of kind of disconnected communities, although relatively close to the city centre. Again, poor outcomes for the young people and the residents of the area. And so we knew as a city council we needed to bring about a process of transformation, and this image is of the Cardroom estate, which was at the heart of that area. So we worked with government. In fact, in the millennium, this New Islington was a millennium community. So we managed to secure public support and funding investment from central government. We built a partnership with Urban Splash, a Manchester-based developer that many of you will know. And if we come on to the next slide, I've done a bit of a before and after. You'll see it's a very different place now. So this is 20 years later, 20 plus years later, but there was a huge design process that got us to here. And it was very much about master planning, as Sadie was saying, about putting the natural environment. There were two canals running through the area, but there wasn't at Marina. The New Islington Marina became the kind of anchor piece of infrastructure, creating a much more attractive environment, parks, opportunities for the whole canal community to grow up, and a houseboat community was there. A lot of new housing has been developed. There's some commercial space, there's great restaurants, coffee shops. The whole area has got far more vitality now. If we come on to the next slide, the importance of having people at the heart of that, and actually there was a huge engagement process that went on, and having those climate ambitions, having the commitment to people, and over time we have driven value. So you can see some of the mills that were restored in the background in the top left image. We did work with the Canal and River Trust. This was a massive kind of partnership piece. Many more developers in the area now, but there's a whole kind of new way of life, new set of communities that have grown up both on the water, in the converted mills, in the new build housing that's gone in here. We've got quite a lot of the modular housing that Splash have been developing in this area of the city as well. And it's recently been identified as one of the kind of most hip places to live in Europe. So we're really proud of that transformation. And it does take time, but those same principles that we've got in the infrastructure design principles of climate, people, place, and value are at the heart of this scheme. So this is kind of one example of what we've been working on, and it's now about to go into a future phase of development towards the back of Ancoats. And then I'll show you a more recent scheme that many of you may have seen in the press. If we come on to the next slide, please. This is Mayfield. So again, going to be a hugely transformative project for Manchester. Those of you who know the city, to the right of this image is Piccadilly Station, our main railway station, connecting both north and south, down to London and across to our east, west and Pennine Rail links. The scheme is again being brought forward as a public-private partnership. You've got railway interests that are represented by LCR, London Continental Railways. You've got TFGM, the Transport Group for Greater Manchester involved. Manchester City Council are here as landowners. And about 4 years ago, we selected our development partners, you and I, who have brought forward a scheme. As you all know, these things take time, and the kind of anchor of this scheme is a new six acre park, and the park reveals the River Medlock. So you can see in the image there the river that has been sitting in pipes and culverted and kind of inaccessible to communities for a very long time, again through that period of industrial decline. That will be opened up. We were successful in a bid into government to secure building funding of 23 million about 9 months ago now, and that money is to bring forward the park. So construction is underway. There's all sorts of archaeological finds that are being discovered as this project progresses. But again, it has that ambition to put nature at the heart of development, to make this very much about a people place where the buildings have a lot of porosity. I'll show you an image of it in a moment, of kind of the relationship between the inside and the outside. It's very much about animating, bringing to life a part of the city that has been cut off from the local communities. A lot of interest, and using nature and nature-based solutions to add value, to add diversity, to address some of our climate challenges, and make that very visible. So you can see through these two projects, I hope that we do it in a way that's compelling, but also kind of in terms of the core assets, very visible in terms of how we approach transformation. So I'll bring you on to the last slide for me, which shows you an image of Mayfield once developed. It's a mixed-use scheme, so there'll be commercial space, offices, a fair amount of residential as well, the park at the centre. So here, and all sorts of, at the moment, meanwhile spaces, what we call worthwhile uses, which are animating, enabling people to get into the site to see how it opens up. This is not dissimilar to the scheme that happened behind King's Cross, where you go through that steady period of transformation. And in time, there'll be all sorts of, sort of more temporary food offer at the moment, but we'll have some great restaurants, gathering spaces, all that kind of hybrid between live workspace, really exemplified in this image, but putting people and place, climate and value very much at the heart of Mayfield. So I hope that's been helpful, just to see how Manchester approaches these issues, where we place our kind of strategic thinking, and two projects which I hope exemplify lots of what we'll be talking about this evening. My job now is to hand over to Judith Sykes as our next speaker. So I'll hand you across to Judith.
Thanks, Louise. Really inspiring images, and to see that sort of long-term transformation of Manchester. So my name is Judith Sykes. I'm a director of Expedition. I thought I'd talk about the design principles, but with a particular focus on climate. So if you go to the next slide. So climate is the first of the 4 design principles, and with infrastructure accounting for over 50% of the UK's emissions, we need urgent transformation of our sector. If you go to the next slide. So most infrastructure companies have set a carbon reduction target mirroring or even bettering the Climate Change Act in line with science-based targets. Alongside declarations that have been made by many local authorities, route maps to zero carbon and absolute zero are being prepared across the board to work out how we get there. Each infrastructure sector has its own challenge. While the power sector is focusing on operational carbon, our work suggests in other sectors that capital carbon, that upfront investment in steel and concrete, is the biggest source of emissions. And so what is clear is that we need design and innovation, and we need it urgently. Next slide. So we as the design group were interested in finding out how the design principles are currently understood and applied. So we partnered with the Institution of Civil Engineers to carry out a survey. We had nearly 1,000 respondents across all sectors, and with a range of experience and backgrounds in the respondents. When we asked them whether sufficient importance is given to the design principles, climate change mitigation and adaptation received the lowest score out of all of the principles highlighted here on the left. We were really surprised that sort of more than 60% of respondents said that climate isn't getting the attention that it needed. So, there is a question about where is the emergency in practice. If you go to the next slide, we also asked what one thing would help change your approach, and overwhelmingly it came up with the following sort of top 3, which related to this more cultural aspects of and the environment that we create in our organizations. So they were, we need business models that value outcomes, we need a cultural change in our organizations, and we need greater collaboration between the different sectors and between different disciplines. So if we go to the next slide. So it's not just about building design skills, but it's creating the environment and the right conditions to enable that sort of design talent to flourish. And this is a picture of the wetland bowl, which exists, which is at the heart of the Olympic Park, which I had the privilege of working on and helping to deliver with a number of other colleagues. And it's a brilliant piece of integrated infrastructure design, creating resilient communities, creating an ecological enhancement and a park that can be valued by the future residents or the residents that are now moving into this area, all built using lower carbon materials. But also it was delivered by a single authority which had a model and a mission that valued sustainable outcomes and fostered interdisciplinary design. If you go to the next slide. So another great example of multifunctional infrastructure design is the embankment, built in the late 1800s to alleviate the pollution of the River Thames, but also incorporated transport, flood defences, and amenity within that sort of section. It was also delivered by a single body, and Claire will come on and talk about the evolution of that scheme and some of the work that she's learned from in the delivery of Thames Tideway. But if we are to hit our national carbon reduction targets, then we need this holistic approach. We should be looking more closely at the intersections between different infrastructure systems to deliver great emissions reductions and greater resilience. However, what we face at the moment is in the way in which the different infrastructure bodies are currently constituted, it makes it difficult to do this. If you go to the next slide. Another example of such approach has been put forward by my colleagues' Expedition for the Lower Thames crossing, currently designed just for road traffic. Could it be used also for rail? And in doing so, could it also encourage a modal shift to lower carbon and lower energy modes? This is what sort of Sadie was talking about earlier, sort of doing more for less, or at least doing more for similar cost or investment. And this is also the sort of thinking that we're calling for in the design principles when we set out the need to appreciate that wider context and deliver a systems approach that creates multiple benefits. And if we do want to meet our climate commitments, then it starts with the strategic decisions that we make about infrastructure planning. Thank you. And I think at this point, I will hand over to Anthony.
Many thanks, Judith. So I'm Anthony Dewar, I'm the Head of Buildings and Architecture at Network Rail, and I love this picture on the screen here. It's from 1825, at what is commonly accepted as the first ever passenger railway service in the world on the Stockton to Darlington Railway, and it shows the celebration which took place of this incredible event. To me, it conveys what infrastructure is all about. It's there for people to travel, trade, or communicate. Mobility is innate to human civilization and growth, and it reflects our society's desire to travel and progress. As we move through space and time for work, school, or leisure, we support the economy, connect with people, and interact with our natural and built environment. Good design develops, encourages, and sustains this. Today, I wanted to talk you through our design approach in Network Rail, covering how our design framework, disruptive design thinking, and marginal gains in design leads to positive benefits. Next slide, please. I wanted to start by reflecting for a moment on the size and the scale of the GB rail network. We have 20,000 miles of track, 30,000 bridges, tunnels, viaducts, and thousands of signals and level crossings. But coupled with this, as shown on this slide, our built environment estate is huge, and it's the gateway to the rail network for our passengers and workforce, and houses key critical equipment needed to run a train service. Often our focus in the infrastructure industry can be solely on our large enhancement projects, for example, like the redevelopment of London Bridge. But there are over 2,500 stations in the UK, and over 80% of these stations are small to medium in size, and as well as all the other footbridges, platforms, lighting systems, etc. So today in my presentation, we'll focus on our diverse infrastructure network, not just on specific large schemes. We manage our built environment estate following 4 policy drivers, what we call the 4 S's: sustainability, safety, stewardship, and satisfaction. Design impacts on each of these. Next slide, please. So just focusing on railway stations for a moment and how the demands of modern passengers have evolved from 1825. But what will people want in 30, 50 and 100 years' time? The annual National Passenger Survey statistics consistently indicate the station environment is one of the key drivers of passenger satisfaction at stations, together with the need for information, closely followed by facilities and access. Again, design impacts on all of these. We commissioned Arups to fully examine the future role that stations will play in our towns and cities, and their report, Tomorrow's Living Station, sets out a way of thinking on how stations large and small might need to evolve to keep up with the pace of change and meet the needs of tomorrow's passengers. Last year, we followed that up by launching Think Station, which aimed to directly communicate with a diverse range of stakeholders. We held workshops throughout the country that involved community groups, designers, local authorities and national government departments. And it was an initiative which helped us to define a brief for a next generation of medium to small stations and fed into an international design competition we have launched to develop a station system fit for the next generation. Next slide, please. So in Network Rail, my team has led on laying a framework or the foundations for ensuring we embed design thinking and good design outcomes into our culture and works. We published our principles of good design to re-elevate our focus on design in the built environment and updated them last year to include a 10th principle entirely devoted to the environment. My team and I have hardwired these into our engineering and assurance standards to embed them into our design and engineering processes. All of these have a line of sight back to the National Infrastructure Commission design principles of climate, people, places, and value. Next slide, please. We've introduced a design panel, which is run by the Design Council, and with their regional alliances means it can cover our geographically diverse network. The purpose of our design panel is to provide independent design advice and guidance to Network Rail and our design teams to ensure that good design and the concerns of not only communities, but also stakeholders will be considered throughout the planning and development process. We also have a network of regional design champions who are a devolved regional point of contact and offer design assistance and learning, thereby giving regional teams ownership of built environment design outcomes. Next slide, please. We've focused on developing an outward-looking collaborative culture and are working with UK design experts to publish design guidance manuals covering a range of topics, including wayfinding, station design, footbridges, toilets, urban rail, master planning, and many, many more. And we've made these documents engaging in their format and open source, so our organisation, our supply chain, and our passengers and line-side communities can utilise them to ensure we achieve good design outcomes. Next slide, please. So that's an overview of how we developed a design framework into our organisation. Fostering creativity and developing an outward-looking collaborative culture is a key priority for Network Rail. For the last 4 years, we've been partnering with the RIBA in using design competitions to demonstrate the benefits of disruptive thinking on design and outcomes for our passengers and the environment. We started to look at rail footbridges, whose designs had been untouched for several generations, and we ran an open ideas footbridge competition. That competition was incredibly successful and attracted 120 entries from over 19 different countries. We've developed the winner of the footbridge competition into a standardized bridge, as well as launching a catalogue of other footbridge designs and launching research and development projects to look at bringing concept bridges of the future into reality. Next slide, please. We've also been using design thinking to look at less glamorous and very simple built environment components. For example, the platform coper. These are the large concrete tiles at the edge of a railway platform. We have a low carbon concrete workstream underway, and this slide shows how marginal gains to one platform coper, when magnified across our vast GB network, can result in significant environment benefits. Next slide, please. A key challenge to embedding good design in large organisations is promoting an understanding of the value of design. There often isn't always the will to spend much on design unless the benefits are clear and quantifiable, So we have to find ways of demonstrating these benefits early on. So finally, I wanted to end with some statistics of the wider benefits of infrastructure while using a railway station upgrade scheme in Burnley as an example, where good design has resulted in much wider societal benefits, like a reduction in antisocial behaviour, socioeconomic regeneration, and the increased use of green forms of transport. Thank you. I'll now hand over to Claire.
Thank you. Today I'm going to talk to you about my work on Thames Tideway Tunnel and its design, where I act as a lead architect and legacy design advisor. The project is also known as the Super Sewer, and you can see it under construction across London at the moment. It's a multi-billion-pound engineering-led project, and as an architect I work on a fairly small part of it, but I hope an important part of it. And today I want to focus on the collaborative effort and commitment the project has made to achieving an optimum legacy and value for the project for Londoners. Next slide, please. The River Thames is London's largest natural resource. It's also London's largest open space. And though it's been it's cleaner now than it has been for many centuries, many people don't know that as little as 2 millimetres of rainfall in London can cause spills of raw sewage into the River Thames. Every year, enough raw sewage discharges into the river to fill the Royal Albert Hall approximately 450 times. This is poisonous to fish and causes a depletion of oxygen in the water, which has major impacts on the aquatic ecology. And to understand why it's happening, you do have to look back at some of that history of the development of London's sewer system. Next slide, please. So Londoners have always used the Thames and its tributaries to dispose of their sewage. As London got bigger and populated by more people, those tributaries of the Thames became more and more foul and more polluted, and eventually were culverted or covered over. So they're now part of the sewage system, though they are also more affectionately known as London's lost rivers to some. As all of that sewage continued to flow down into the Thames itself became eventually more polluted, which culminated in the Great Stink of 1858, when the Houses of Parliament had to relocate to Oxford because the smell and the stench was so bad. And they turned to the pioneering engineer, Joseph Bazalgette, to find a solution for them. He came up with the intercepting sewer system, which is the black lines on this diagram here, to catch those flows before they hit the River Thames and safely convey them to the east of London, where they could be treated and the effluent released back into the River Thames. In order to build those low-level sewers, the ones nearest to the river, it was necessary for them to reclaim land from the River Thames. And you can see in the bottom right there a picture of the project while it was reclaiming that land. If we go to the next slide, please. And then this is the section that Judith had up also, the solution to the problem. So we can see here the low-level sewer is the circular pipe in the river wall. And that along its length had a number of pressure relief valves effectively, which would, in the event that the system became inundated, would release that effluent back into the Thames. And the picture in the top right there is a photograph of one of those combined sewer overflows, which are dotted along the banks of the River Thames. That one is at the River Effra as it discharges near Vauxhall. And the problem is now that that system is inundated very, very regularly, on average once a week or about 50 times a year. So that raw sewage is flowing into the Thames all the time. While we're on this slide, though, as Judith said, we should comment on the completeness and the holistic vision that Bazalgette had for infrastructure, building not only the sewer, but also the cable subway above it, the rail line, which is now part of London's tube network, the roads, and also the public gardens that they provided. These aspects and elements of the design really tried to express the scale and endeavour of the engineering achievement. And the style which was come up with for it is now internationally known as a placemaking, as a sort of feature of the London embankments, and are automatically recognised across the world. This was the level of legacy that we knew that the Tideway project would have to build on. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the 21st century solution. The Thames Tideway Tunnel is a 25-kilometre tunnel that runs from Acton in West London to Abbey Mills pumping station near the Olympic Park in East London. It's 7.2 metres in diameter and falls from 33 metres deep at number 1 on this map to 66 metres at number 23. The vast majority of this infrastructure is very deep below London, but at all of the coloured circles on here, we're actually intercepting a flow from one of those lost rivers or the sewers into London. And above ground, there is a series of above ground structures and infrastructure that are required, so mechanical and electrical equipment and ventilation. Each of those locations is very different, and each demanded a very much focused placemaking solution to the design and integration into their environment. About 1/3 of these sites are in Thames Water operational land or private land. That leaves 2/3 which are actually in London's public realm. And of that, a half are also foreshore sites, which means we are also having to reclaim land from the foreshore of the River Thames in order to build them. Next slide, please. That's like this site at Victoria Embankment foreshore, which is our site opposite the London Eye. And actually, if you turned Bazalgette's section around and look the other way, this is what we would look like. Here you can see how the system works. You can see the low-level sewer in the base of the existing river wall, and how when it fills up, it will overflow into new structures, which will drop that flow down through a drop shaft and convey it through a short connection tunnel into the main tunnel, which generally sits under the middle of the Thames. Though unfortunately, you won't be able to see these sort of cathedral-like spaces and the scale of the engineering in these shafts. People will be able to see and understand the public realm that sits on the top of it. And that was one of the key areas that we understood that we could add real value to this infrastructure project. Next slide, please. This brand new land and the other foreshore structures will provide brand new places for London. Each individual place has been developed in response to its context, its history and character. The importance of public realm has really been borne out through the global pandemic, as people have searched for places to sit, unwind, meet and enjoy the outdoors. Tideway, the client body responsible for building the sewer, is committed to achieving a lasting legacy for Londoners, and making these places to be as high quality and as good as possible was part of this commitment. Next page, please. To achieve that value requires an incredibly collaborative approach to problem solving between disciplines and across different parts of the project. These are some of the images for some collaboration we had with the hydraulic and the marine engineers, looking at the impact of the flow on the river of our structures as we put them in and drop them in the foreshore, but also of the forces that were being created by the flows within the sewer and how they would need to be engineered around. In addition to these more watery engineering disciplines, we work with civil engineering disciplines of tunnelling, structures, material specialists, mechanical and electrical engineers, GIS and BIM specialists, environmental disciplines such as aquatic ecology and archaeology, odour specialists, to say nothing of operations, health, safety and security. My own team was comprised of architects, landscape architects and artists. To achieve successful communication between all of these groups required that the client establish a culture of respectful and open communication and collaboration. Next slide, please. But it also required a commitment to quite rigorous processes and attention to detail to ensure that these different how these different designs interface with each other throughout the process is completely captured. We had a progressive design and assurance process focused on collaboration between ourselves and the contractors. And though architecture is worth only 2% of the capital budget of the works, the needs for the discipline were also coordinated into an overall process to ensure that we achieved quality. All of this needed to be supported by a client body that was willing to invest the time and the tools to bring people together with a shared vision to make the project as good as it could be. Next slide, please. Together as a team, we have designed a system that works and is safe to use and to operate, but also for boats to move around. It will provide high quality public realm, new aquatic environments through environmental intertidal terrace planting, better vantage points from which to understand the history and development of London, artworks that celebrate, amongst other things, Bazalgette's legacy and achievement, and occasionally places that Londoners will be able to dip their toes in their now much cleaner river. Next slide. Thank you. This is the main event. Here's the hard engineering for you at the end of that as well. Thanks. I'm now handing back to Karen.
So thank you so much, Claire, and thank you to all the panelists for your amazing presentations. I think it's testament to those brilliant presentations that we peaked at 112 people and we've still got 107 on the line. So everybody is really fascinated by your talks. So I think we'll be starting the Q&A session, and we've got, I think, yeah, everybody's coming back in there as a panel. Now, interestingly, we had a first question very early on from Paul, who said, oh, forget it because it's not relevant, but I think it is relevant. So I'm going to ask this anyway. So Paul was talking about reframing the concept of national infrastructure to include, you know, not to just include the physical infrastructure like digital, bridges and so on, but to include digital infrastructure. So does anybody have any comment on that, about how the digital infrastructure, Internet and Things, you know, and so on, meets in with this physical infrastructure that we've concentrated on today? Anybody like to take that one?
Well, I mean, I'll kick it off. I mean, you know, digital infrastructure does come into the NIC's remit, of course. But I think as technologies change and as our infrastructure sort of moves from the physical to the virtual, then yeah, we really are going to have to start to sort of re-establish, I suppose, what we mean by our infrastructure, and sort of rebalance, I think, how we not only design and procure and think about the way that our infrastructure will deal with sort of various challenges, but bring that sort of blue sky thinking, if you like, into the heart of what we do. And I think it's, you know, this goes a little bit back to the kind of risk appetite and the innovation and the need for us to continually, I think, make sure that we are absolutely at the forefront of innovation and ensuring that that is part and parcel of the sort of wider infrastructure discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Sadie. I agree with that. Any panelists want to add to that? Or
I can come in and add something to that. I think I see it as absolutely underpinning some of the transformations that we need, either to make sure that we use our resources in a sort of smarter way, so and then by doing so that we optimize the use and make the most of the use of that infrastructure as well. It's key to what Sadie sort of mentioned at the beginning when we talk about sort of in support of the principles of sort of design with less, do more with less approach. Then digital infrastructure is key to helping us to do that.
That's great, thanks, Judith. And I suppose not unconnected with this is a question from Themis Prodomachus, and he says, is there a framework that evaluates the impact that new and emerging technologies can have? And obviously not all new and emerging technologies are digital, but some of them are. So would any of the panelists like to pick up that on new and emerging technologies and a framework around that?
I'll pick up on the framework bit, if I may, because this is a very challenging area, which I touched on in my presentation, about how does one measure the impact of design? Because in infrastructure terms, we've very got used to measuring in sort of business cases, which wants quantified outputs. But I showed with my last slide about how, yeah, there are some much softer indicators that design can have an impact on, that we as an industry and politically need to work on to develop a framework which brings those softer societal measures into place.
Yes, Thank you, Anthony. That's really helpful. Thank you. I think that's answered that. So I'll go on to a next question, which is dear to my heart, sitting here in Wales, which is a question from Ian Sheridan, and it's about regional influence. So it's absolutely clear that London has many well-designed infrastructure projects, for example, King's Cross and so on. And we've heard about London. We've also heard about Manchester. But how does the National Infrastructure Commission ensure that many smaller cities and towns, and indeed countries in the UK, benefit? And how do you influence to attempt to steer more government design budget across to regional projects?
Thank you. Well, I'll dip in quickly, then perhaps hand over to Louise, who did such a good job of, I think, of expressing how other cities and places are really delivering quality. I think that there are a few things that's really going to help. National Infrastructure Bank that the NIC helped to set up, I think, is really going to be focused on those sort of regional differences and making and ensuring that the investment is going to move away from London. I think that the design principles are for national infrastructure, and when it comes to talking about value and cost, we have to I think understand the real value of infrastructure that infrastructure has in unlocking opportunity, and to that end, the National Infrastructure Commission's done a lot of work around cities, and we're around how infrastructure investment in cities, and now we're looking to towns, really outside of London really is really sort of part and parcel of the focus of a lot of the work that the NIC is doing, and it's done that through pilot projects that are around the whole of the UK, not just focused in London, and again some really simple steps as to how we can help and encourage cities to use infrastructure investment to unlock those bigger issues that we talked around climate and prosperity. So I'll hand over to Louise. Perhaps you can give a little bit of colour to that as well.
Yeah, I'm happy to, and it's really an agenda that's close to my heart. Sadie's spot on, and of course the Infrastructure Bank is going to be based in Leeds. So that's a good thing, to be based in a northern city. There's a huge amount we do as cities. It's a collaborative environment that we work with other cities through the Core Cities network as well. And actually, we've been having conversations at some of our National Infrastructure Design Group meetings around wanting to do more with core cities, so that's something that we're working on. I think the other thing to say is that so much opportunity exists in cities, opportunities for growth, very closely linked to infrastructure. So that's why I showed the example of Mayfield, where you've got our main station. It'll also be the one of the hubs for our east-west connections, and the sort of expansion of the Northern Rail network, and many of the ambitions that we have to be better connected in east-west direction as well as a north-south direction. If you look in cities like York, there's a huge amount of regeneration development, housing, commercial space again happening close to the station. Similar story down in Bristol, the whole transformation of the Temple Meads area. So I think for me there's just a whole set of opportunities around major infrastructure transformation, regeneration of cities. I saw there's another question in the chat around, are cities here for the future, or are people going to want to be in rural communities? We're seeing that a lot of people have come back into Manchester in the last week. We're seeing offices fill up again. I probably think we've all experienced it's been quite tough to be isolated through a lot of the last year, and there's a kind of human condition, isn't there, that cities let you come together, interact, and how we do that in a way that thinks about a better environment for the future, that addresses climate challenges, and really has that kind of people-based placemaking at its heart is a lot of what we talk about at the city scale.
And that's prompted something for me, based on what I see happening around me, is that a lot of companies are reviewing how they work. You know, a lot of big organisations are reviewing because they've seen the benefits of people working from home. So there is this shift, although there will be a blended working. And do you see the cities changing to accommodate that, in terms of perhaps some people living in the cities, and more so than we have had recently? You know, the tendency is to live outside and travel in for a lot of cities. So do you see London perhaps becoming even more residential? And, you know, how are the discussions panning out around planning of cities?
Yeah, I'm happy to comment on that. I mean, in Manchester, part of that recovery plan I showed you, the Powering Recovery, puts placemaking, puts a public realm, gathering spaces. We all know that, you know, the cities that we choose to go to for some of those, when it's easier to travel again, Italian cities or little French towns, or the other places where you think, well, I want to go there because it's a great quality of life, it's a good urban environment. There's a lot of learning that we've done, certainly in Manchester through the pandemic, that people want to be in safe spaces, they want to be able to gather, they want to be able to connect, and an awful lot of shift, I think, between some of our commercial spaces having more of that kind of informal space where we're going to see a shift in kind of work patterns, less of a kind of commute, I think, more of a livable city, to answer your question. But there's quite a bit of infrastructure, both green, blue, and sort of more hard infrastructure that needs to come into cities to transform them.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And there's a question which came in at 4:27 anonymously, but I guess from that timing, I think it's aimed at Judith's talk, and it's, to what extent are long-term management maintenance embedded in the design?
I don't know which design perhaps that you're referring to, but I think there is definitely within the design principles we're looking at the sort of full life cycle of design, and life cycle thinking it has become is really critical to what we mean by good design in the design principles. And I think infrastructure companies, and Anthony might comment on this, are in a better place than, say, what we see in the building sector, because they are owners and operators of that asset. They perhaps actually are able to do that long-term sort of thinking, because they are responsible for that asset over the long term, and the sort of the maintenance question is a really good one when you also think about the infrastructure that we have today. Most of it exists in that will be there with us in 2050. And so when we think about the design principles, you know, a lot of this is going to be about how we retrofit those assets to deliver on those ambitions, and particularly the climate targets.
Yeah, thanks for that. And Anthony, did you want to come in as well?
Well, yeah, I suppose just to add to that's something we sort of discussed at the design group, and yeah, it's very, very key to Network Rail, and where I started to show that the vastness of our estate, that often our minds in infrastructure industry can get very focused on the creation stage of an asset, but we've got assets that are over 150 years old, and in fact many of our assets, the majority are that old, and that brings with them significant maintenance challenges. So if we don't consider upfront the maintenance elements, we leave legacy issues for future generations. So it does need to be built in at the heart, and as Judith outlined, all the sort of environmental positives that can be plugged in as well.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think people are recognizing that, aren't they? And from what I've observed, people are, you know, even in early stage business cases, people are considering the long-term maintenance and disposal and the full life cycle, particularly in the carbon, carbon calculations of projects. So that's very much the direction of travel, isn't it?
I think it's also just worth pointing out that, you know, the sort of the data intelligence that we're now able to get on our infrastructure, not only through the design, through BIM, and then through the sort of lifespan, really will, I think, give us a whole layer of intelligence and opportunity to have much more kind of have infrastructure that is much more efficient and in the long term. So just to sort of just tying back to that sort of bigger digital piece, I think it, you know, and can't say the word now. How all of these things interlock together, and I think is something that a number of the questions have sort of touched upon.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. So going very quickly through the questions, I can see there's loads more coming in, and that's what always happens. So I do apologise if we don't get time to get to any questions, but we have one from Muir MacDonald here about the very much likes the principles, but is there anything in the principles about the need for separate projects to be required to work together? And you can see that all over places, can't you, where different projects are totally unconnected, and the requirement for projects to adapt as they need and priorities change and so on. And he also talks about end of life as well. Anybody like to pick that up? Claire, I saw you nodding there and you've been quiet. Did you want to pick that up?
I know that through the regulatory system and the planning system, the Planning Inspectorate for National Infrastructure Schemes is now demanding that nationally significant infrastructure projects talk to each other, because we're in the process on another project that I'm working of collaborating. So I think that aspiration that is there in the design principles is coming from government as well, to see a really holistic approach is sort of filtering through, and it's important that all those regulatory systems are very demanding of infrastructure projects, and want to see the evidence of how we're talking to each other. Yes.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. That's really helpful.
Yeah, those interdependencies, that was the word I was trying to say. Thank goodness Claire picked that one up, so I could remember the word that I was trying to use. And those interdependencies, cross-cutting issues, you know, that's one of the reasons why the National Infrastructure Commission was put together in the first place, was to give a sort of body that really could give that holistic overview. So I think that there is an, you know, as Claire said, there's a real understanding that this is a really big opportunity, I think, to be much more, you know, efficient, whole scale in terms of all of our infrastructure, and those interdependencies, and the way in which the resilience of our infrastructure often relies on different sectors, I think is something that we will come to understand. Well, we understand now much more than we did, and we have to sort of plan for the future. So that sort of planning for those you know, the floods that stop blow up the electricity, that stop the trains, you know, there's a kind of, you know, there's absolutely definitely a domino effect, I think, that we have to plan for.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, our design panel process that we've introduced, one of the many positives our design panel process is it has really challenged us as a client organisation to look beyond the red line. We can be very insular in infrastructure and within engineering in infrastructure to look within the red line. So the design panel process has really pushed us to look beyond that in the surrounding communities, and how we can engage and interact with the communities and other projects.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. That's very helpful. I'm just looking puzzled because a question I was going to pose just disappeared. So I'll go on to the next one and then. So this is again anonymous. So right, okay, this is the one about disrupting the supply chain. So supply chains generally tend to be large multinationals, you know, have specific compliant products and teams that work alongside, you know, and the sort of contractors are not perhaps incentivized to look for better innovative products from new suppliers. So how do we address that? How do we approach innovation for infrastructure and disrupting a supply chain? What are your thoughts on that?
I can speak a little bit about what we did on the Olympics and some research, more recent research that we've been looking at this sort of innovation that you need, particularly to sort of deal with the net zero challenge. And I think on the Olympics that we were able to have quite, the project was able to have quite a lot of purchasing power. And so it was by being clear about the ambition, it then set up some sort of supply chain engagement sessions, which then helped bring forward innovation from the supply chain. But it did so in a way that also shared risk between the client body and the supply chain itself. And I think we were able to deliver quite a few innovative projects on the back of that, back of the Olympics. We've been doing some more recent research with big infrastructure companies looking at how they're investing with innovation to meet those sort of net zero. And one of the things that they say is, and again, Anthony might be able to comment on this from a sort of real world experience, is that it's quite difficult to find their way through to the supply chain and differentiate, you know, really good SMEs and innovation SMEs from the sort of myriad of people that come forward with particular proposals. So we do need to support and find a way to sort of broker those arrangements with the supply chain, and particularly in the context of the Social Value Act as well, you know, and creating value throughout the supply chain through public infrastructure projects.
I'm happy to comment from a Manchester's perspective as well, and it's very much about that social value piece. So we procure a lot of public realm, highways work, all that kind of urban infrastructure you'd anticipate, often with partners as well. And it's exactly right that we can have real influence because of the kind of scale of the procurement. In the past, we evaluate on quality as well. So design, quality of materials, quality of placemaking, very much part of the assessment process alongside price. Until very recently, we had 20% of our evaluation process for social value and for businesses that give back. There's a preference for local businesses where they're available in the supply chain. We've just increased that to 30% actually, where the additional 10 is all around businesses that can demonstrate both social value and how they're addressing the climate challenge. So it's quite interesting now to see much greater kind of alignment around the benefits that big contracts can bring socially and environmentally.
We reflect in my team a lot on the Egan report published in the 90s, that this is an area of significant challenge for the whole of the construction industry / infrastructure. And we reflect a lot on our role in Network Rail as a client organisation, and that the client leadership is incredibly important in this area, because the supply chain may not modify their behaviours or approach unless clients show clear leadership in this area. So on one of the slides, I showed all the design manuals that we're publishing, and they are setting out our minimum expectations of what we think good looks like, what good outcomes are, that they're built into our standards, so they become our specification in effect. Yeah,
and you build that into the whole procurement process, don't you? Yeah, and that's understood. That's great to hear. Thanks. So the next question is about interdependencies, but it's really an interesting question. And one of the talks had a slide which sort of summed this up, but I can't remember which one of you it was. I'm sorry. But this is about delivering multiple benefits. So there are siloed regulations, there are siloed organisations. You've got rail, you've got roads, you've got all those. So how can we resolve the challenge of making sure that there's a holistic solution to infrastructure? Rail to solve road freight congestion and so on, and obviously with an ultimate aim of zero carbon, which is the first principle about climate. So anybody like to pick that one up?
I think Sadie sort of started to answer it. And it's definitely something as an organisation and as a design group that we're really interested in promoting. And I think it sits at the level of the sort of IPA, the Infrastructure Projects Authority, and within government, to be able to sort of bring together those bodies so that we have more integrated infrastructure approach. But again, through the research that we're doing is that because those projects exist, so the infrastructure companies themselves are constituted as separate bodies with very specific targets, it can be difficult just by virtue of the way in which they're set up for them to sort of to enable that collaboration. And so what you're seeing here is some examples of where we've broken through that organizational structure, but organizations like I3P that are bringing together those infrastructure companies, particularly to look at those cross-cutting innovation themes, I think are brilliant. But I think it does need to sort of go to government as well, and the role that the NIC in itself are doing in trying to promote those sort of more cross-cutting approaches, I think is brilliant.
Yeah,
I think I mean, it's a really good question, and on the face of it, it's a complete no-brainer, isn't it? If you're laying a railway, why don't you at the same time run a digital cable? You know, it's if Bazalgette was thinking about it all those years ago, you know, how come we've got ourselves in a situation where, you know, the risks are such, or the maintenance is such, or the, you know, the red line that Anthony talks about is so, you know, it's like, oh no, you can't have your maintenance people coming onto our, you know, our bit of land, and I think that there's a lot of you know, regulation and red tape that is necessarily there, but actually isn't thinking about the bigger picture. So I think it needs change at every level, and government needs to help guide what that looks like, and to think about how those interdependencies and those different sectors are encouraged, either by stick or carrot, to make sure that they really are getting those efficiencies, because in the end we're not going to hit any of our targets unless we're all, I mean, you know, there was a great question talking about those interdependencies and saying, how do we, you know, how are we more than the sum of our parts, and we're never going to be more than the sum of our parts, and we're never going to achieve those really high targets that we've set ourselves, not only in quality but in climate issues, you know, unless we work together, because we're certainly not going to do it as a kind of individual siloed sectors.
Thank you. That's really helpful, Sadie. Now we've got far more questions than we can possibly answer, so I'm going to promote one which I think is of high importance, and that is from Effie Yinwa, who asks, would you describe the 2038 net zero emission target plan as being too optimistic or realistic, and what major factors are considered within the design process to create the right balance between optimism and realism?
I think that probably relates to the Manchester strategy, doesn't it? As well as, you know, that we've now got the new national ambitions as well. So certainly for Manchester, I mean, that ambition was declared a couple of years ago. It felt ambitious then. That's when we were looking at 2050, so we wanted to come earlier. But there is optimism, I would say, but as a group of local politicians who voted that in the first instance, then it's about setting a challenge to the sector, to construction, to you know, to the automotive sector, to, you know, if we look at where the emissions come from homes, from cars, from industry, you know, so it doesn't just apply to growth and development, but it applies to so many sectors. So it is a high ambition. We've mapped how we get there. I mean, a big part of it is the shift to hydrogen as well. We're doing a lot with our utilities companies. I think there's quite a lot of innovation coming through. We do quite a lot with Energy Northwest, for example, and they're really innovating in the space. But it takes multiple partners, just as Sadie said. You need government, you need government agencies, you need local government politicians and industry to all kind of share some of those targets. I think it's right to have ambitious targets, but the real delivery is what matters, and the change that we'll bring.
Yeah, well, thank you, Louise. I'd like to finish on that positive note in terms of climate change targets, net zero targets, and so on. And I'm sorry if we haven't had a chance to answer your questions. I think the events team are going to try and gather those questions and get some answers to you. And they'll also, all delegates will receive a follow-up email inviting you to provide feedback on this and topics for future sessions. And I think this one has been probably the most active topic I've chaired. So perhaps we'll have another one based around this at some point. So I just like to say a huge thank you to the panel for your excellent presentations and your most brilliant response to questions. It's really been a stimulating discussion. I've really enjoyed it. So thank you for your contribution. Thanks to the many tens of, we've only just got down to 80 now, so many tens and over 100 at one point participants. We're really grateful for your participation, and we hope that you enjoyed this as much as the panel and I did. We'll be holding another Academy Cafe soon, and we hope that some of you will be able to join us. And of course, this event has been recorded and will be available on the Academy website shortly. So I want to thank you all for your contributions. I won't summarise anything at all because it's 5:15 and we have to finish, but just thank you all very much and look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.